This is the hanging sign, and it has a dark secret. The hanging sign was only added in Minecraft.20, but the lost story that it reveals stretches long before that. And so without any further ado, let's begin. It was only a few 100,000 years ago when the villagers were thriving, living very happy lives, as it was then that they were able to farm more than enough food to feed everyone, and were creating a multitude of brand new technologies, such as the stonecutter, which was allowing them to build much more complex structures. And more than that, they were even able to start recording their progress in books at a very large scale. And so it was because of all of these different things that the villagers were at a point of stability and safety. And so it would have been very fair to say that the villagers at that time were living very nice lives. Well, that was during the day, as during nightfall, everything would change for the villagers, as during night they would have to hide in the corners of the houses, preparing for what would come, as from the deepest darkness of the world, the zombies would rise, and every night they would begin to attack the villagers, attempting to ravage their society. And this was happening every single night. However, luckily, most of the time, their attacks would fail, as typically the zombies would be unable to pass through the mighty Iron Golem. And even in the very unlikely scenario that they were able to get through him, they would struggle to break down the doors of the villager houses and get to them. And so, because of that, most of the time, the zombies would just burn to death when the sun rises in the morning. Meaning that most of the time, the villagers were safe. And well, that cycle of raiding, trying to break down the doors, failing, and then burning to death in the morning would repeat itself every single day. And so it was after a few thousand years of surviving like that the zombies were starting to get quite annoyed, as they just really weren't getting anywhere with all this effort that they were putting in all the time. And so it was on one night that they decided to change things up a bit, as now they were not only going to continue with their nightly raids, but they would also start stealing things from the villagers. Now, at first, this plan failed badly, as anything that they tried to steal was already securely placed into the buildings or the surrounding environment. And so because of that, they really just couldn't take anything. But after a few days, a few of them realized that they could just rip out the signs from the front doors of the villagers' houses with relative ease. And well, once that was figured out, zombies all across the world began tearing out the signs of the villagers' houses during each of their nightly raids. Now, at first, when the villagers saw this, they were very confused, as why were the zombies doing this? But it was fine, it didn't matter, they could just put up new signs with ease in the morning. Except, no they couldn't, as the next night the zombies would steal their sign, and the next night they would do it again, and again and again, and it was getting really annoying for the villagers, as they didn't have all this wood to spend on creating new signs every single day. And so that cycle of sign stealing continued for a few months, until the villagers just had enough of it. It was getting far too annoying for them, and so they decided to have a meeting on what needed to be done. And so it was from that meeting that one message came across to all of the villagers, and that was that they needed a new sign, one that would be far more secure in their buildings, one that the zombies wouldn't be able to steal. And so the quest of creating this new sign was given out to all of the villagers to work on, with the reward being many emeralds. And well, as everyone was getting quite annoyed at the zombies at this point, I just really wanted this issue to be fixed, mixed with the fact that they may be able to get a ton of emeralds out of it, they all began working as hard as they could to create this new sign. And well, thankfully, it only took a few weeks when the brand new sign variation was created. Now, this new sign variation would be made out of 3 times more wood and would have iron chains for support, which would allow the sign to stay in place for longer. It would also have the ability to be hung from walls or ceilings. That's right, the villagers created the hanging signs. Now, not only was it much more secure, it did also look much nicer, and so it was because of that no one was against using these brand new signs, as they fixed their zombie issue and improved the look of the village. And so it was over the next year or so that all villagers converted their signs to these new hanging signs. And well, it was a success, as zombies' theft of the signs dropped to 0%, as they were just unable to rip these hanging signs out of the walls and ceilings of their houses. Now, while this was great news for the villagers, to the zombies, this was a great annoyance, as not only were they now losing at their attempt to infect all the villagers with their virus, but they were also failing to steal something as simple as a sign. And so, this was really getting to them. They felt as if they were just a failure of a species. However, it didn't take them too long to figure out a new way of antagonizing their enemies, the villagers, as they eventually found out that they could just stand there, right by their new and special hanging signs when the sun rose, and when that would happen, they would catch fire, which would spread onto the hanging signs and burn them. Finally, a success for the zombies. They were getting back at the villagers. However, unluckily for the zombies, it wasn't going to stay like that for much longer, as the villagers now had a meeting much quicker than before on how they could stop the zombies from doing that again. And thankfully, this time, it only took them a few minutes before one of the villagers spoke up with a brilliant idea.
Listen, all we need to do is to just go through that portal, the final one to the nether, and get some of those netherwoods. And then we can make signs out of that, as netherwoods just don't burn. And so, the zombies won't be able to burn our signs anymore. They can just suffer in the sun.
Everyone went silent. The nether was the most dangerous place in the entire universe for the villagers, and everyone was scared of it. However, despite their fear, that was actually a really good idea. And so, because of that, a group of brave and loyal adventurers was organised and was sent out to go to the final nether portal, currently in the overworld. Now, this final portal was located far, far away in the deep, dense jungle. And so, it took those adventurers a few weeks before they reached it. But when they did, there was no turning back, and so they all charged into the nether and began their mission. Now, thankfully, it only took them a few hours to gather all of the wood that they needed, and they were just about to be heading back when the unthinkable happened. One of the villagers caught the attention of a piglin. This was bad, very bad, as the piglins were evil creatures that wouldn't stop hunting them until they were given gold. And well, none of the villagers had any gold on them, and so because of that, they just started to run as fast as they could, holding all of the wood that they had collected, and luckily, they made it through that portal without anyone being killed. And so, they were safe, right? Well, not quite, as it was thundering in the overworld now, and there was a creeper right next to the portal. And well, just as luck would have it, lightning would strike that creeper, which turned it into the deadly, charged creeper. Now, things looked very bad for the villagers, as the creeper was likely going to explode and kill them all. But things were just about to get so much worse, as a group of piglins, the ones that had been following them, began to appear from that portal. And just as they were winding up their crossbows, ready to shoot the villagers, the charged creeper exploded, and they all died. But not only that, the portal to the nether, the final portal remaining to the nether in the overworld, was destroyed, meaning the nether was permanently cut off from the overworld. Now, meanwhile, back home, none of the villagers there had any idea of this tragedy happening at that nether portal, because originally they just thought that those adventurers must have got lost on their journey and were just taking a bit longer than they were meant to. However, after a few years had passed and they still hadn't returned, a search party was created and was sent out to find them. And well, they did. kind of. As after a few months, they made it to that final portal in the jungle. But when they get there, what they see is a sight so horrifying that even the zombies would be ashamed of it, as they saw the shattered skulls of their allies scattered all over the floor, and the broken portal to the nether. And so, they were terrified of what they saw, as they had no idea what could cause this to happen, as that nether portal was thought of as invincible, and why were their skulls shattered? But despite this atrocity, all the netherwood that they had collected was still there, and so these villagers reluctantly began to pick them up, glad that they had something from their lost allies, when they noticed something. A piglin head? That was strange. They had never seen that before, and so they go to pick it up. And on closer examination, they can see that this beast was also brutally killed, as its head was so precisely cut away. Now they were even more confused, as how could all of this happen? It just doesn't make any sense. But they didn't have the time to wonder about that, as they did have to get back home soon. And so it was because of that they just decided to take this piglin head along with the remains of their allies and the wood that they collected and return home. Now, it was a few months later when the searchers returned home, and when they did, they told everyone what had happened. And well, everyone was very sad to hear what had happened and was also very confused. But really, in the long run, they just had to move on. Their deaths were needed to create these new signs, which thankfully they did, as in a few days they were able to make millions of these netherwood signs, which were distributed all across the world in many different villages in only a few months. And well, they worked just as expected, as the zombies were no longer able to burn their hanging signs, as the netherwood was fire resistant, and so all of the villagers were happy. Well, most of them were, as a lot of them didn't really care about those signs, as they were too busy being confused by that piglin head that those searchers had found in that site, as in their recorded history, no one had ever had a piglin head before. They just didn't think it would be possible to have one. And so it was because of that there began to be fights over who should have this piglin head and what caused it to exist. And this fighting was beginning to get quite out of hand, so much so that some villagers were preparing for war. And so to stop this from happening, one villager decides to break in to the house where the piglin head was being stored and steal it, and to then hide it up on the top of a random mountain, never for anyone to have again, as if no one has it, then the arguments should hopefully be over, and the war shall never be fought. Now, to that villager, it sounded like quite a good plan. And well, it was, as the arguments quickly died down, and the villagers moved on to far more important things in their lives. However, little did that villager know, putting that piglin head on the top of that mountain would have consequences that would change the world forever. As when that villager was going down the mountain, he was spotted by one evil being. An evil being that we know today as the Pillagers, whom followed him back to his villages, which began the start of the Dark Ages for the villagers. Now, this was a time of great instability, violence, and brutality for the villagers, and I'll get into more detail on the specifics of what these pillagers did, but for now, all you need to know is that from that day onwards, they killed millions of villagers, and more than that, they also stole their hanging signs. Now, why would they do that? Why would they want these signs? They seem useless, right? Well, the simple answer is that those signs had iron in them, which the pillagers needed in order to make more iron axes, which they used against the villagers. And so it would be that while raiding a village, they would tear apart these signs from their structure, but then they would force a villager to melt down that iron so that they could make those axes. And once they had what they wanted, well, they ended him. Now, this was all very bad for the villagers, as not only were they being put through so much suffering by the pillagers, whom were killing many of them and were destroying their farms, but they were also being forced to aid the pillagers in their own suffering. And so it was because of that many villagers began to take down the hanging signs that they had spent so long trying to make and hid the iron within them, so that the pillagers would never get them, and so they could reduce their own suffering. And so it was all because of those pillagers that the hanging signs were lost forever. But worse than that, these pillagers were brutal, and so the hanging signs wasn't the only thing that the pillagers caused the extinction of for the villagers, as the bundle, yes, the bundle was also stolen from the villagers by the pillagers. But it was with those bundles that the pillagers stole that they were able to learn something that was so evil, so corrupted, and so powerful that the world would never be the same. But to learn about that tragic story, you'll need to watch this video.